The first thing the county decided about Cecily Vane was that she would not last the winter. This verdict was reached before she had unpacked a single trunk, before she had crossed the threshold of Harwick Hall, before she had done anything at all except arrive on a gray October morning, in a hired postchaise that was not, the assembled household noted, a private carriage. She stepped down onto the gravel drive with her chin up and her gloves worn at the seam of the left thumb, and the groom who steadied her elbow caught himself startling at her eyes. They were blue as autumn sky, and not afraid. Mrs. Ta. Petford, the housekeeper, stood at the top of the stone steps with her hands folded. Behind her, 2 footmen in Harwick livery held their expressions, like men who had learned that expressions cost something in this house. The Marquess of Harwick did not come out to greet his new wife. This was not surprising. This was, in fact, the county's first piece of evidence for its verdict. Lord Harwick, Edmund Rowe, the 6th Marquis, master of 14,000 acres stretching from the Vale to the northern ridge, had not left his study since the funeral arrangements of the last Lady Harwick, 3 years past. He had not attended the single breakfast at which Cecily's father, pressed by debt and age and the Marquess's solicitor, had agreed to the match. He had sent a proxy. The proxy said very little. Cecily said even less. She had looked at the terms laid before her and understood she was being handed a locked room and told to call it a home. She was 22 years old. She had no illusions. She climbed the steps of Harwick Hall with her worn gloves and her careful chin, and she did not look back at the hired postchaise as it turned. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet courage it takes to walk into an unknown life, stay close. Her story is only beginning. The county of Thornbury had a long memory and a particular regard for its own opinion. It had watched the last Lady Harwick, gentle Margaret Forsyth, wither in the hall's cold rooms over 4 years of a childless marriage, and had watched Lord Harwick grow quieter and colder after her death, until the word circulating from Thornbury village to the Latchfield assembly rooms was not difficult, not reserved, not proud, but feared. He cancelled tenant leases without negotiation. He sent letters to tradesmen that brooked no delay. He had not attended the assemblies in 2 years, not attended church in 6 months. His land agent, Mr. Price, Greaves, carried all communications to the hall, and returned with sealed replies that no one was invited to question. When it was learned that Lord Harwick had contracted a second marriage to a Miss Vane, younger daughter of a Derbyshire baronet, whose estate was largely mortgaged, the county had not been surprised. What surprised it was the girl's composure on arrival, and then within a fortnight, the first evidence that she was not going to be handled. Cecily spent her first week learning the house. Not its public rooms, not the portrait gallery with its black and white marble floor, but the parts that governed the daily life of 37 people. She went to the kitchens, the still room, the laundry court, the dairy, the housekeeper's room, where Mrs. Petford kept her ledgers. She asked the steady, particular questions of a woman who needs to understand a thing before she can be useful to it. What had run short last winter? Where the chimneys smoked in the east wing? Which of the dairymaids had a mother who was ill? Mrs. Petford, who had prepared herself for any number of new mistresses over 30 years of service, had not prepared herself for this one. On the 5th day she unlocked the still room without being asked. Lord Harwick remained in his study. He came to dinner each evening at 7 precisely, sat at the far end of the dining table from his wife, and spoke, when spoken to, with complete courtesy and no warmth whatsoever. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and a face that had learned to hold very still. His eyes were gray, the shade of moorland cloud in November. He ate what was placed before him, thanked no one, and withdrew at 8. The county's second judgment of Cecily Vane was delivered by Lady Driscoll of Staverley Park at the Latchfield Assembly Rooms in November to her particular friend Mrs. Caro, that the new Lady Harwick was pleasant enough, but would amount to nothing, being a manageable sort of girl who would manage nothing. Lady Driscoll said it with the particular affection of a woman who had long administered the social weather of Thornbury and found in Cecily no threat to that administration. She said it with a smile. Mrs. Caro nodded and touched her fan to her lips, and let the verdict stand. Cecily was not in the assembly room to hear it. She had attended for 30 minutes, been received with the careful warmth the county extended to women whose situations required acknowledgment without endorsement, and then excused herself to assist old Mr. Dodd. Harker, the apothecary, whose gout had made the evening walk from his rooms more difficult than he had anticipated. She walked him home in the dark in the November cold, a footman carrying a lamp behind them. Mr. Brade. Harker was 81 and had no family in the county. He said she was very kind. She said she was cold, and would he be so good as to let her wait inside for the carriage? She had drunk his tea and listened to him for an hour about the countryside as it had been 60 years ago. This was reported to Lord Harwick the following morning, not by any design of Cecily's, but because the footman told the groom, and the groom told the stablemaster, and the stablemaster mentioned it in passing to Greaves, who mentioned it to no one. The Marquess had a habit of arriving early to the stables, and he was there when the stablemaster spoke. He said nothing. That afternoon, when Cecily came into the morning room to find him there unexpectedly, examining a map spread across the writing table, he did not leave. He stood at the far side of the table, and she sat at the near side, and they occupied the same room for 40 minutes, without speaking, and neither of them found it necessary to manufacture an excuse to end it. The county did not know about this. The county was occupied with the question of the Harwick tenants. The Harwick estate held 11 tenant farms, ranging from the large, prosperous holding of the Hatch family on the southern flats to the modest cottage and garden of old Thomas Corey. On the ridge, Greaves managed the leases. For 3 years since Lady Margaret's death, the leases had been managed strictly. Rents were collected on the day, repairs deferred, any request for accommodation returned with a letter citing the terms of agreement. 2 farms had been vacated in consequence. Greaves considered this efficient. Lord Harwick, who reviewed accounts in his study, had not disputed it. Cecily discovered the situation not through the accounts which she was not yet invited to review, but through the dairymaid, whose mother was ill. The mother was Ellen Corey. The cottage on the ridge had a roof that let in water on 3 sides, and Ellen Corey could not get warm. The Ridge Farm's lease was held by her son Thomas's eldest, and the request for repair had been in Greaves's correspondence basket for 14 months. Cecily did not go to Lord Harwick with this. She went to Greaves. She asked to see the correspondence basket. Greaves showed it to her, with an expression that told her precisely what he thought of her prospects. She read the letter from young Thomas Corey. Brief, twice apologized for, carefully reasoned, and then she read the 5 letters beneath it from other tenants, with similar requests, in similar postures of deference. She sat in Greaves' office for 2 hours, and read every deferred request in the basket. Then she wrote a list, organized by urgency and cost. She brought the list to Lord Harwick's study that evening at 7, knowing he had not yet gone down to dinner. She knocked. He said, "Come in." And she came in and placed the list on the desk before him, and remained standing, because he had not invited her to sit. He looked at the list. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. The fire in the study grate was the only sound. "You went through Greaves' correspondence," he said. "Greaves showed it to me," she said. "I asked." He looked at the list again. She watched his face and could read nothing in it. And she had learned, already, in 6 weeks of marriage, that this was not coldness. It was something more like a man who had spent years building a wall and did not know if he was still behind it or if it had simply become the whole of his face. "There is a woman on the ridge," she said, "who is very cold." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Send for Greaves in the morning." She said good evening and went to dinner. The list was acted upon within a fortnight. The Corey roof was replaced first, because Cecily had put it first. Young Thomas Corey, arriving at the hall to speak to Greaves and finding instead the new Lady Harwick, stood in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands and looked at her with such stunned gratitude that she had to look away from it. She told him she was glad the weather had held for the work. He said, his voice thick, that his mother sent her thanks. She said to give Mrs. Corey her regards, and to send word if there was anything further she required. He left. Mrs. Biz Petford, who had been standing in the passage, said nothing. Mrs. Petford, however, told her sister, who lived in Thornbury Village, and Mrs. Petford's sister told the vicar's wife. And the vicar's wife, who had her own views on the management of Harwick estate and had been keeping them to herself for 3 years, let the story loose with a precision and warmth that moved through the county like a change in weather. It was Lord Harwick's custom to ride the eastern boundary of the estate on the first Tuesday of each month. He rode it alone, or had done since Margaret's death. On the first Tuesday of December, he returned to find Cecily in the stable yard in the cold, in a blue riding habit that had been let out at the seams and recently pressed. She had been waiting, Mrs. Brash. Petford would later tell the groom, for approximately 40 minutes. She asked, when he dismounted, if she might ride with him the following month. She said she would like to know the land. He was quiet for a moment. The stable yard smelled of horses and cold stone and the particular dampness of December. He said, the first Tuesday, if the weather holds. She said that she would manage, whether or no. She turned and went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment after she had gone. The groom looked at the ground. Lord Harwick turned the word manage in his mind, not as a calculation, not as assessment, but in the way a man turns a stone he has picked up from a path and found unexpectedly solid. That was the afternoon, he asked Greaves, at the end of their weekly accounting, to have the east wing chimneys seen to. December sharpened into the particular cold of a Thornbury winter, and the hall began imperceptibly to change temperature. Not in the rooms, though. Those improved as the chimneys were attended to. In the corridors, in the kitchen, in the ease with which the household moved. Cicely had a faculty for being useful without inserting herself, present without demanding attention, that the staff recognized as something different from the usual management of a house. She knew the name of the scullery maid's youngest child. She asked Mrs. Petford's opinion before acting on most things, and took it seriously. She appeared in the kitchen on Christmas morning to help prepare the tenants' gifts, not supervising, but working. Her sleeves turned back, her hair pinned simply. Lord Harwick, coming through the kitchen passage unexpectedly, found her there. She did not see him. She was listening to the cook explain the sugar work on the small cake, meant for Ellen Corey, whose roof had held through the first freeze. Her expression was entirely unguarded, interested, and warm. A slight smile at the corner of her mouth, he stood in the doorway and looked at her for 3 full seconds before she became aware of him. She straightened and turned, and the warmth in her face did not disappear, but steadied. She said, "Good morning, my lord." He said, "Good morning." He looked at the cake, then asked, after a pause slightly longer than necessary, if he might see the list of this year's tenant gifts when she had finished. She said, "Of course," and he left. The cook looked at the door where he had been, then at Lady Harwick, and said nothing. The county was, by December, in possession of enough evidence to begin revising its verdict, though Lady Driscoll of Staverley Park was not yet prepared to revise hers. She aired it again at a small dinner at the Carrows on the 14th of December, in terms nearly identical to those of the assembly rooms. Lady Harwick was a manageable sort of girl, well-intentioned but without consequence. The word manageable was Lady Driscoll's particular instrument. She used it on women who threatened to outrun their expected scope. She said manageable and meant forgettable. She said manageable and meant you will not matter here. The Carrows' other guests included Mrs. Vine, whose family leased the southern property, and young Miss Alderton, lately returned from Bath. Both heard Lady Driscoll's verdict and said nothing. They had already begun to weigh it against their own observations. Edmund Rowe, the 6th Marquess of Harwick, had spent 3 years building a particular kind of silence around himself, and he had built it well. What he had not built it against was a woman who did not require him to fill it. He was aware, in January, that something was shifting in the house, and could not at first name what it was. He had lived for 3 years in rooms that were managed with efficiency and occupied with professional quietness. The sounds of Harwick Hall had been the sounds of a well-run institution. Meals served, fires laid, orders carried out with no element of spontaneity. Now there were other sounds. A kitchen cat that he had not known existed, taken in apparently by Cecily from the stables. The low hum of the dairymaid's voice when she thought she was alone. Mrs. Petford, on the morning of New Year's Day, laughing. He had not heard Mrs. Petford laugh in 3 years. He had been married before, and he knew what it was to be in a house that held warmth. What he had not known, until this winter, was the specific quality of warmth that arrived not from affection directed at him, but from a woman who directed her warmth at the world and allowed him to be in its vicinity. Margaret had loved him with a careful, anxious attention that had been partly afraid of him. He had not wanted her to be afraid of him and had not known how to prevent it. His coldness, learned in a childhood of fathers who did not bend, had calcified after her death into something he mistook for permanence. She was not afraid of him. This was the first thing. The second thing was more difficult to name. She looked at him. When she looked at him with the same direct attention, she directed at everyone, and there was no calculation in it, no performance. She looked at him as if he were a room she had not yet understood, but expected to. He found himself, in January, looking for her. Not with any declaration of this to himself. He happened to pass through the morning room at the hour she was usually there. He happened to arrive at the stables when she was returning from her walk. On the first Tuesday of January, the weather did not hold. It snowed, steadily, from before dawn. He went down to the stables to say that the ride would be postponed, and found her already there, in her riding habit with her boots laced. She looked at him. He looked at the snow. He said it was not safe. She said the eastern path was sheltered by the ridge. He said 2 miles of ridge path in January snow were not a simple amendment. She said she had ridden the ridge path in Derbyshire in February. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had not yet seen on his face, something that was almost, in some compressed and guarded version of itself, the beginning of something like amusement. He said, "Then I suggest you lead." They rode for 2 hours. She did lead, and she knew the path better than he had expected, and she asked questions about the land that were not the questions of a woman performing interest. She asked about the drainage on the north field. She asked about the legal status of the disputed boundary with the Staverley property. She asked, when they stopped at the highest point of the ridge and looked out over the white county below, whether the ridge had a name in the old records. He said it was called the Warden's Back in documents from his grandfather's time. His grandfather had said the ridge watched over the vale. She looked at the vale. She said she thought it did. He looked at the side of her face, her cold pinked cheek, the breath visible in the January air, the way she sat, the horse, with a quality of belonging to the landscape that he had not anticipated. He said nothing and looked away, and was careful. The kitchen cat named Pilgrim took to following Cecily through the house. Lord Harwick, who had not been aware that he noticed this, noticed it. The county by February had reached an informal consensus that Lady Harwick was not, after all, the manageable sort of girl that Lady Driscoll had named her. The evidence had accumulated in the methodical way of evidence produced by daily life rather than performance. The Corey roof. The deferred repairs attended to across 11 farms. The tenants themselves who spoke in Thornbury Village and at the Latchfield Market with a warmth. The county did not usually hear directed at the great house. Ellen Corey had told Mrs. Bolde. Thetford's sister, that Lady Harwick had come to the ridge herself to see the work properly done, sat in the cottage for half an hour, drunk weak tea, and been entirely at ease with it. Harker at the apothecary told anyone who cared to listen that she had called on him twice since November, and had brought him a preparation from the still room for his gout that was more effective than anything he had concocted himself. Young Miss Alderton told her mother that she had sat next to Lady Harwick at the Carrows' dinner, and found her the most sensible, unaffected woman she had met since coming out, and that there was something about her, a particular quality of attention that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she saw what you actually were, rather than what she expected. Lady Driscoll heard all of this, and found in February that she needed a stronger instrument. She found it at the Latchfield Assembly Rooms on the night of the 15th of February, when the occasion was large enough, and the company assembled sufficient for the verdict to carry. Lord and Lady Harwick attended together. This itself was notable. Harwick had not attended the Latchfield assemblies in 2 years, and his presence, tall and still in a perfectly fitted dark coat, produced the particular attention that prominent men who do not seek attention produce. He arrived with Cecily at his side, and performed all the social obligations, being, Cecily had learned, perfectly capable of courtesy when he chose to apply it, and then stood, as was his custom, slightly apart. Cecily did not stay at his side. She moved through the room. She spoke to Mrs. Elfer, Vine, to Miss Alderton, to the vicar's wife, to 3 young women making their first season whose nervousness was visible across the room, and who, after 10 minutes of Cecily's particular undivided attention, looked considerably less nervous. She found old Mr. Harker, who had come with his nephew, and made sure he had a chair near the fire. Lord Harwick, from his position near the east wall, watched her. He watched her the way a man watches something he has been trying to assess at a reasonable distance and has found that the distance no longer serves. There was nothing deniable about it by February. He had stopped denying it to himself 3 weeks ago, on a morning when he had come into the morning room and found her reading by the window, and the room had felt, quite simply, as though it contained something necessary. What he had not yet done was anything about it. Lady Driscoll arrived at 9 with her niece and Mrs. Carow, and moved through the room with the air of a woman taking inventory. She found Cecily at 11 minutes past 9 in conversation with the vicar's wife and young Mrs. Vine, and waited for a natural pause, and then inserted herself with the smooth expertise of 30 years' practice. "Lady Harwick," she said, with a warmth that had no heat in it, "how good of you to come. We have so hoped to see you. I do think it shows such determination in a young woman to make herself useful in a county where she is not yet known." She let the word determination fall with a weight that made it mean something else entirely. "Though I understand the tenants have been very grateful, very manageable. The arrangements you have made." Cecily looked at her. She said, "I have found the tenants to be very capable people, Lady Driscoll. I believe most of the arrangements were simply waiting for someone to attend to them." Lady Driscoll smiled. She said that was very like Lady Harwick, to put a modest face on it. She said modesty was a charming quality in a young woman, new to a position of some importance. She said she hoped Lord Harwick appreciated the efforts of his manageable little wife. The phrase landed in the room's air the way Lady Driscoll intended. Mrs. Carrow's expression was carefully neutral. The vicar's wife looked at her gloves. Young Mrs. Vine looked at Cecily. Cecily said, "I believe Lord Harwick and I understand one another well enough, Lady Driscoll." She did not elaborate. She turned back to the vicar's wife and continued what they had been saying. Lady Driscoll moved on. What she could not know, standing in the assembly room with her back to the east wall, was that Lord Harwick had been close enough to hear every word. He had heard manageable little wife. He had heard it land. He stood still for a moment after Lady Driscoll moved away. He was a man who for 3 years had not intervened in social weather. He had not seen any social weather that was his business to intervene in. He was not, in this moment, deciding whether this was his business. He already knew it was. He was deciding something else, the distance between what a man knows and what a man does about it. He crossed the room. He crossed it in the unhurried way of a man who does not need to hurry because nothing in the room will stop him. And he arrived at Cecily's side and placed his hand at her elbow. Not possessively, not dramatically, but with the specific, unmistakable placement of a man who is telling a room where he stands. To Cecily turned. She looked at his face, which was still as ever carefully held. But something in the gray of his eyes was different from any expression she had seen in 4 months of marriage. He said, "I believe there is a set forming." She said, "I do not think you danced, my lord." He said, "I do not come." He led her to where the vicar's wife and Miss Alderton stood, and said to the vicar's wife, with a directness that made the assembly room's nearest cluster of guests fall quiet, that his wife had mentioned the restoration work on the church roof had been delayed for want of a patron, and that he would speak to Greaves in the morning. He said it plainly, without grandeur, looking at Cecily when he said, "My wife," in a way that was not loud, but that carried to every person within 6 feet. The vicar's wife said she was most grateful. Miss Alderton looked at Lord Harwick, and then at Cecily, and pressed her lips together to manage her expression. Lady Driscoll, from across the room, watched. Her fan stilled against her palm. It was not a dramatic scene. It did not have the quality of theater. That was, somehow, the thing that made it land. Lord Harwick did not perform. He simply stood at Cecily's side and spoke of her work with the specific authority of a man reporting a truth. And the room, which had known him for 30 years, and had never once seen him speak, unprompted in a social assembly, about anything not strictly his own business, was very quiet. They rode home in the carriage that evening in silence for the first 3 miles. The Thornbury road was dark, and the carriage lantern cast a small gold light inside. And Cecily sat with her hands in her lap, and looked at the window and felt the particular tension of something unfinished hanging in the air between them. She said at last, "You did not need to do that." He was looking at her. She could feel it. Before she turned, he said, "I know." She turned. In the carriage's confined warmth, the distance between them was small, and she was aware of it, in the specific physical way she had grown accustomed to being aware of him. His stillness, the breadth of his shoulders, the quality of attention in his gray eyes that she had once read as absence, and had long since understood, was something else entirely. She said, "What did you want when you crossed the room?" He was quiet for a moment. The carriage wheel found a rough patch of road and settled. He said, "To stand beside you." She looked at him. She did not say anything. The carriage lamp moved slightly in a turn, and the light shifted across his face. And she saw for the first time, without obstruction, what she had been too careful to name until now. He was afraid, not of her, of what wanting cost. Of the last time he had wanted something in a house and it had been taken from him. She said Edmund. She had not used his given name in 4 months of marriage. He went very still. She said his name the way she had said everything. Directly, without performance. Looking at him when she said it, she said, "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face that was not calculation and not assessment. He reached across the space between them and took her gloved hand. Carefully, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has decided to do a thing, rather than simply found himself doing it. He held it, and did not say anything, and she turned back to the window. And the carriage road moved beneath them through the dark. The county had its full account of the assembly rooms by the following Thursday. What spread through Thornbury was not the drama of confrontation. There had been none, but the texture of the evening. Lord Harwick at his wife's elbow, Lord Harwick's voice citing her work to the vicar's wife with the ease of a man who considers that work his own. The dance set which he had declined and the manner in which he had declined it, standing beside her as though declining to leave her side, was the same thing. The specific quality, as Miss Alderton reported it to her mother, of a man publicly choosing where he stood. The vicar, who had long awaited the church roof, and had not expected it to arrive via Lord Harwick's unexpected presence at a Latchfield assembly, gave a sermon that Sunday on the subject of stewardship, which everyone in the congregation understood to mean something, though only some of them could have said what. Lady Driscoll did not attend that Sunday. She sent word that she was unwell. Mrs. Carow attended, and sat in the Staverley pew, and thought about the word manageable, and how 30 years of useful social instruments had never yet one of them come to nothing without warning. In March, Cecily rode the eastern boundary with Lord Harwick for the second time. The snow had gone, and the ridge was beginning to show the first pale green of the season, and the vale below was the particular soft brown of earth about to turn. They rode at his pace, which was faster than her natural preference, and she did not ask him to slow it. And he noticed she did not, and checked the pace himself without being asked. At the top of the ridge, at the point they had stood in January, he dismounted, and she dismounted, and they stood side by side, and looked out at the vale, and did not say anything for some time. because by March they had both learned that silence between them was not an absence. It was where they kept the things they had not yet said aloud. He said at last, "My first wife was afraid of this land." She looked at him. He was looking at the veil. He said Margaret had found Harwick too far from everything she knew. He said he had not understood this until too late. He said he had not known how to give her what she needed, and had not asked what she needed, which was the fault that mattered. He said it simply, without self-pity, and without drama, the way a man reports a wrong he has lived with, long enough to see its shape clearly. Cecily listened. She did not fill the silence when he stopped. He said, "I was not unkind to her, but I was not present." She said, "And now?" He turned and looked at her. The March light was the kind that arrives before the season has fully committed itself, pale and honest and without flattery, and in it his face was simply his face, without the assembly room guard, without the study's careful stillness. He said, "Now I find that I cannot remember clearly how I was before you came." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something. She had no intention of reporting to him just yet. She said, "It has only been 5 months." He said, "Yes." She looked at the veil. She said, "I think I knew, when I read the terms and agreed to them, that I was agreeing to something larger than a house. I did not know what. I thought I could manage it." She used the word deliberately, and he heard it, and a small, entirely involuntary thing happened at the corner of his mouth. He said, "And can you?" She said, "I appear to be managing rather well." He said nothing, but the thing at the corner of his mouth remained, and she had learned, by March, that this was as close to laughter as the Marquess permitted himself in daylight. She turned and remounted. He stood a moment longer, looking at where she had been, before he followed. Mon de Pie. Bis. The arrangement with the church roof was confirmed in April, with Greaves and the church committee and the vicar all present, and Lord Harwick's signature on the letter Cecily had drafted and presented on a Tuesday morning with her corrections marked in small, clear handwriting in the margins. He had read it twice, then asked if she had read the terms of the original endowment. She had. They spent an hour in the study going through the documents, together with the quality of shared work that had become, by April, one of the things she looked forward to. She was aware by April that she loved him. She had not said this. She was 22, and she had been in this house for 6 months, and what she felt was not the love of a woman given time and ease and luxury, but the love of a woman who has seen a person clearly, in their difficulty and their stubborn decency, and chosen them anyway. She thought he was somewhere near the same place. She was almost certain. The hand in the carriage, the ridge, in March. The study where he had begun in February to say come in before she knocked. And she did not know how he knew it was her, and did not ask. On the evening of the 14th of April he came to find her. She was in the morning room, reading with Pilgrim the kitchen cat, arranged across her feet. The fire was lower than it should have been, and she had not noticed because she was deep in a chapter. He came in without knocking, which was new, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room, and she looked up and said good evening. And he came in and sat in the chair across from her, which was also new. He said, "The Latchfield Spring Assembly is the 22nd. She said she was aware. He said, "I should like to attend with you." She looked at him over her book. She said, "You attended in February." He said, "I attended in February because I had a thing to make clear." She said, "And in April." He said, "Because I find I prefer the evening when you are in it." She put down her book. The fire settled. Pilgrim made the small rearrangement that cats make when they are aware something significant has occurred without being certain of its nature. She said, "Edmund?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I should like to tell you something, and I should prefer you not to do anything about it immediately, but simply to hear it." He said, with a careful stillness that she had once read as coldness, and now read as the full attention of a man who does not half attend to anything. "I am listening," he said. She said, "I am glad I came here. I am glad of this house and this land and the county and the tenants and Mrs. Petford and Pilgrim, and I am glad of you. I did not expect to be." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. He said, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had used his in January. It had taken him until April. He said it with the specific weight of a man who has chosen the moment, the way everything he did was chosen rather than happened. He said, "I am glad you did not go." She said, "I was not going anywhere." She had said it before, in the carriage. She said it again now, as what it was. Not a reassurance. A fact. He reached across the small distance between the chairs and took her hand, ungloved this time, her actual hand, and held it. The fire settled again. Somewhere outside, the April wind moved through the warden's back, through 14,000 acres of thawing earth and the ridge and the vale, and the hall was quiet and warm and occupied by 39 people, one of whom was a kitchen cat who had decided 3 months ago that this was home. The Latchfield Spring Assembly took place on the 22nd of April, and the county of Thornbury attended in considerable numbers, partly because the season demanded it, and partly because by April the county of Thornbury was curious in the way that communities are curious when something they did not predict has been unfolding quietly in their midst. Lady Driscoll attended. She was recovered from her February absence and arrived with her niece and Mrs. Carow, the particular composure of a woman who has decided to be present at a thing she cannot prevent. She had revised her assessment of the new Lady Harwick in private over the months of winter, and the revision had not been comfortable. She had not yet arrived at anything she was prepared to say aloud. Lord and Lady Harwick arrived at 8:30. He handed her down from the carriage, and she took his arm as they came in. And it was apparent to the assembly room that this was not the courtesy of social compliance. The arm she took was the arm of a man who stood slightly differently with her on it. Not softer, not less contained, but differently oriented. As a compass needle orients to a fixed point, they moved through the room. He did not station himself near the east wall. He moved with her, to the vicar's wife, to Miss Alderton, to young Mrs. Vine. And he was not silent in the way he had been in February. He was present, in the way that comes after a thing has been decided. Old Mr. Harker was there with his nephew and was doing better. He said so to Lord Harwick directly, which was not something old Mr. Harker would have attempted in October. Lord Harwick said he was glad to hear it, and asked about the nephew's situation, and asked with the attention of a man who intends to remember the answer. Young Thomas Corey was not at the assembly. This was not his world. But his wife had said something to Mrs. Vine, who said it to the vicar's wife, who had brought it tonight as the best news she had. Ellen Corey had been warm all winter for the first time in 4 years, and that she had called Lady Harwick an angel, and that this was the Corey family's considered opinion, and they stood by it. The vicar's wife shared this with Cecily. Cecily said she was very glad, and that it had been nothing, and the vicar's wife said it had been everything. Lady Driscoll was near enough to hear this. She stood with Mrs. Carow, and her fan was still. She had used over the winter 3 iterations of the word manageable, and all 3 of them had come to nothing, and she was woman enough to know when an instrument had broken. She waited until Cecily was briefly apart from Lord Harwick, and crossed to her with her chin level and her expression composed. "Lady Harwick," Cecily turned. Lady Driscoll said, "I have been thinking of what you said, in the autumn, about the tenants, that the arrangements were simply waiting for someone to attend to them." Cecily waited. I believe that was correct. It was not an apology. It was as close to one as Lady Driscoll had come in 30 years, and Cecily understood exactly what it cost. She said, "I have had good counsel, Mrs. Petford in particular." Lady Driscoll said, "You have done well here." She moved on. Mrs. Sigza. Carow, following, glanced back once at Lady Driscoll's back, and made the small private adjustment of a woman who has learned something she will take several days to absorb. Lord Harwick returned to Cecily's side. He had not seen Lady Driscoll's approach, but he saw something in Cecily's face that he could read by April. The particular expression of a woman who has absorbed a thing gracefully that cost her something to absorb. He said quietly. "What did she say?" Cecily said. "She said I have done well here." He looked at Lady Driscoll's retreating back. He said, "She is correct." Cecily said, "She is not as confident as she was in October." He said, "No." She said, "She will find another instrument, in time." He said, "Let her." She looked up at him. He was looking at the room, at the county, assembled around them, at the Thornbury Spring and the Latchfield Assembly, and the 14,000 acres outside that had been cold and closed for 3 years, and were now, by all available evidence, beginning to open. He looked for a moment at the very specific expression of a man who has come back to himself from a distance too long, and is aware, for the first time in years, of what he was before the distance. He said, without looking away from the room, "Miss Alderton's mother is watching us," Cecily said. "Most of the room is watching us." He said, "Yes." He offered her his arm. She took it. They stood together for a moment in the assembly room's candlelit warmth, while the county of Thornbury observed them with the specific attention of a community that has revised a verdict and is quietly gratified to have the revision confirmed. They drove home under the April stars through a county that was already green in the hedgerows and smelling of turned earth and hawthorn. The carriage was warm, and Cecily leaned slightly against the angle of his shoulder, and he let her, and did not move, and the Harwick acres moved past them through the dark. When they arrived, Pilgrim was waiting in the entrance hall, as Pilgrim apparently made a habit of doing after evening outings, arranged on the bottom stair with the authority of a cat, who has assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. Cecily said, "He does not usually wait up." Lord Harwick said, "He is particular about comings and goings." She bent to collect Pilgrim, who permitted this. She looked up at Edmund. The entrance hall was lit by a single branch of candles, and in the candlelight, his face was not guarded and not cold, but simply present, the way a room is present when it is lived in. She said, "Come to bed," he said. She carried Pilgrim up the stairs. Edmund followed, and the entrance hall was quiet behind them, and the candle burned a little longer in its branch, and then guttered, and the hall settled into the particular peace of a house that has been, after a long winter, returned to itself. By May, the county of Thornbury had reached its final verdict. It arrived not in a single pronouncement, but in the accumulative way of things that are simply true. In the conversations at the Latchfield Market and the Thornbury Village Green, in the easy familiarity with which the hall's tenants spoke of their landlord's wife, in the manner in which Lord Harwick himself moved through the county, no longer like a man enclosed from the world, but like one who has found the world worth re-entering. Old Mr. Harker's gout improved enough, by June, that he walked to the church himself to see the new roof timbers go in. He stood in the nave and said it was the finest work he had seen in Thornbury since the great floods, and that he intended to outlive the timbers out of pure satisfaction. The vicar's wife said she would hold him to it. Ellen Corey on the Ridge planted her kitchen garden in March, for the first time in 2 years, because the kitchen had a floor that kept the cold out, and the roof turned the rain, and she had energy for planting again. She sent down a small basket of the first herbs in June, with a note written in a careful hand addressed to Lady Harwick. The note read, in a careful hand, that their family was grateful. Cecily kept the note. She put it in the small writing box she had brought from Derbyshire, beside a letter from her father written in the autumn of last year before the match, in which he had said he was sorry for the necessity, and that he hoped she would find something to be glad of, and that he trusted her more than he could say. She had written back in June to tell him that she had found rather more than something. On a morning in late June, Lord Harwick came into the morning room to find Cecily at the window, with Pilgrim and the writing box open on the table beside her. He looked at the box. He said, "Your father's letter?" She said, "I was reading it again." He sat down in the chair across from her, the one he now sat in as though he had always sat in it. He said, "Will you show me?" She looked at him. She took the letter from the box and held it out. He took it and read it, and she watched his face while he read. And she saw, when he reached the line about trusting her, because his jaw moved once very slightly, the way it moved. When he was managing something, he handed it back. He said, "He was right to trust you." She said he was guessing. He said he was correct. She put the letter back in the box. Outside the June morning was the particular English blue of a summer that has committed itself at last, and the ridge was green above the vale, and somewhere in the stable yard a horse was being let out, and the hall was warm and full of sound in the particular way it had become warm since a hired post-chaise on a gray morning, and a pair of worn gloves, and a chin that was not afraid. He reached across the small table and touched the back of her hand once, briefly, with 2 fingers. Then he picked up the account book he had brought with him and opened it. She turned back to the window. Pilgrim rearranged himself across both their feet. The warden's back kept its watch over the vale, over the 14,000 acres, and the farms, and the village, and the assembly rooms at Latchfield. The county of Thornbury had its verdict, and it would stand. She had come in October in a hired post-chaise, with worn gloves, and no illusions, into a house that had been closed to warmth for 3 years. By June it was open. If her story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you knew. Thank you for staying until the end.